Hi, it's Robin Ricca, and I'll be reading the transcript for the Tao of Climate Activism. What does it mean to be a climate activist? Is it meeting monthly to clean up beaches? Is it confronting politicians or bombing car dealerships? What about a group of moms who print flyers or someone giving a TED Talk? Could it be a combination of these things or none of them? Ask 10 people, you're likely to get just as many different answers. So, what is it? Allow me to start with an official definition. The third edition of the American Heritage Dictionary defines activism as, quote, a theory or practice based on often militant action to oppose or support a social or political end, end quote. The world is not solely comprised of theories, practices, or militant actions. Instead, I believe it is much more. While activism can and does involve academic debates, legislation, and protests, it should also include individual changes and actions. Fundamentally, climate activism is about action with intent and effort, and the orientation of those activities in relation to the individual. That is, there is internal or intrinsic activism, which is action centered on what the individual does for themselves. Then there is external or extrinsic activism, which is action individuals take to initiate change outside of themselves. For example, becoming a vegetarian or installing solar panels is intrinsic activism. Extrinsic activism would include helping plant a community garden or giving seminars on sustainable technology. But honestly, climate activism has no official checklist. My point here is that even the smallest actions can have an impact, though not everyone believes that. For example, Baylor Johnson argues in his 2003 paper, Ethical Obligation and a Tragedy of the Commons, that, quote, there is little reason to think that our environmental problems will be solved by individual voluntary efforts, end quote. But I disagree. It is precisely those individual voluntary efforts which can lead to impactful change. For example, let's say I buy coffee from a local coffee house which only buys fair trade, shade grown beans. For those who may not know, shade grown coffee reduces clear cutting and topsoil loss. I then give several bags as gifts to friends. Turns out they all really like the coffee, so they each decide to purchase a bag, maybe two. Pretty soon, quite a few people are now supporting a business which sells sustainably grown coffee. Now, does my interpretation mean anything goes when it comes to climate activism? Yes, but as with everything else, actions have consequences. There are forms of violent activism such as bombings, rioting, and arson, which I believe are neither sustainable nor worthwhile because of the damage they cause. Yes, in the short term, they may create dialogue and increase awareness. But long term, they can lead to even bigger problems such as increased ideological division, destabilized communities, or even retaliation. On the other hand, boycotts, protests, demonstrations, strikes, and die ins have been proven to be a powerful and effective means of initiating change. Philosophy should also be regarded as activism, especially when facts seem to dissolve into the fog of disinformation and misinformation created by blogs, blurbs, and Twitter feeds. Compounded by short news cycles and 24-hour access, we now live in a world filled with short attention spans and even shorter tempers. But I agree with Kate Rawls when she states in her 1995 essay, The Missing Shade of Green, that philosophy initiates dialogue because it, quote, opens the way for the facts to get in, end quote. In other words, a person can be better guided onto the Tao or path to climate activism through philosophical discussion because the reasoned arguments explain why a particular fact is true and why certain actions and changes make sense. But the real question is, do we have a moral obligation to do something? I believe we do. But rather than activism being measured against some universal metric, our obligation should instead be considered as what we can do based on where we are. Dan Shahar, in his 2016 essay, Tread Lightly on the Climate in a Problem-Ridden World, sums it up perfectly when he says, quote, our duty is to find a place in our lives for activism that leaves room for our flourishing as human beings, end quote. His point is that we should all be activists, but not sacrifice our health or stability in the process. So, when life throws us a curveball, it's perfectly okay to change how much or what we do to stay involved. Finally, can it be fun to be a climate activist? Definitely. Why not help the planet by doing things you enjoy? The point here is to do something rather than nothing at all. So go ahead and write that children's book, read poetry, attend fundraisers, or plant trees with friends. Henry David Thoreau once said that, quote, heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads, end quote. And in my humble opinion, taking any action to protect that is exactly what climate activism is all about.